about, your story and what's LangChain. But how about let's get right into it. What is LangChain?
Sounds good. First of all, thanks for having me here, and thanks
Of
for Race for putting this on. And yeah, really excited to be here. What is LangChain? LangChain is a Python package that serves as a framework for developing applications with large language models. So yeah, a lot of large language models today are great. They're behind APIs. They're pretty easy to call out and use. Yeah, I've noticed when talking with, the way I got started is I was talking with friends who were building stuff in this space.
And then you started when?
So I started in October.
Of 2022.
Of 2022, yeah.
Oh, wow,
so
amazing.
October 25th, I think I was looking at the tweet, or that's when I tweeted about it for the first time. Okay. And so, yeah, I was chatting with friends who were building stuff in this space, and I think they were using GPT-3 at the time, and it was really good, and it was really easy to use because it was behind an API. You don't have to worry about hosting it yourself. A lot of problems removed. But there was still a bunch of other stuff that they were doing in order to make like their end applications. And so I was working at another company at the time, and so I wanted to do something open source. So I took kind of like these common abstractions that I thought I saw and put them into this Python package and released that. And yeah, I think, and so I think the way that I would describe it now, I mean, it changes every week what it is, but I think like the way I would describe it now is it's a framework for developing things with developing applications with large language models. So it has a lot of the core modular components that you need. So not just the API, but you need to load text from certain places. You need to split text in certain ways. You need to use embedding models. You need to, or you generally want to use embedding models. You generally want to put stuff in vector stores. It's pretty useful to connect them to outside tools. And it's pretty, and you have this concept of like prompts, which are now this new way of programming. And so there's a framework around there that kind of like we're developing. So there's all these modular components. And then there's also templates for doing more end-to-end applications. So question answering, summarization, chat, all these things involve taking these modular components and structuring them in certain ways. And so those are what we call chains, and those are some of the pre-built things that make it really easy to get started off the shelf.
And hence LangChain.
Yeah, so lang comes from language, and then chain from chaining them together.
Cool. And I guess like the most interesting part, I guess, it can be built. Is it more like agent with memories? Is it like the ability to join multiple LLM together? So what's like the sort of your key emphasis?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting types of applications that I see can probably be summed up by like a personal assistant style thing, which is like an agent with memory. So what is an agent and what is memory, and what do I mean by this? So I think by default, LLMs and language models are stateless. They don't really remember what the previous input was. They don't remember previous things. So memory is just the really simple idea of giving it some notion of state. And this can be like short-term memory. So ChatGPT, it remembers what the previous message is, probably in a pretty simplistic way. It just like passes it back into the prompt, but that still falls under this kind of like abstraction of what we call memory. And then there's also this concept of like long-term memory, and this gets into some of the retrieval augmented generation stuff that was talked about earlier, where it knows things about a knowledge base or stuff like that. And so I think that's a really powerful thing that allows people to build differentiated products. And then the other aspect is this concept of agents, which involves connecting a language model to other tools and having it decide what it should do. So a lot of the chains that are in LangChain are predetermined steps. You do this, then you do this, then you do this. But I think a lot of the really cool applications come where you let the language model decide what to do. It takes that action, it gets an observation, and then it decides what it should do next. And so this allows for some really interesting behavior where it can write code. It can then run the code, it can then see that there's an error, and then based on the error messages, it knows how to fix it and pass it back. And so I think I take both these ideas and put them into like the same category of like a personal assistant style thing. So I think those are the most interesting applications.
So what are some of the coolest or your favorite child or projects that you've seen built on LangChain so far?
Yeah, I think probably the most like creative and interesting one was Dungeons and Dragons Infinity one, and so this involves like a lot of these concepts. So it has some notion of game state, so it knows like the different things that are going on. And I'm not super familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, so I'm going to mess up a lot of terms. But it has some concept of what's going on, and it needs to maintain that. And then it also has some aspect of conversation because you're interacting with the dungeon master and getting and telling them to do something, and then needs to come up with a response, and then it passes it back, and then that maybe updates generates the game state, and then based on your next input, it passes it back in. And this actually hooked it up to Stable Diffusion as well. So it was generating images to go along with the story. So I thought it was a really complex kind of like system that utilized the language model to do a lot of these things under the hood. And so I think that's the most complex and interesting one I've seen.
That's really, really fun. Can you tell us a little bit about the LangChain Hub? What is it? And yeah, tell us more.
Yeah, so I think the so the LangChain Hub is basically this idea of sharing prompts or chains or other configurations for these applications. So kind of as I said before, the prompt and the prompt template, and by prompt template I mean something that takes user input and turns it into the final string that goes into the language model. So these things are really like a new way of programming these types of applications. And so there's a lot of like little quirks that you can do. So you can have prompts that do question answering. You can have prompts that do question answering with sources and generate kind of like where answers come from. And so there's such a long tail of these use cases and of these things you can do. You can ask it to respond in a certain language or in a certain style. And so we found that people were having a lot of fun sharing these with each other. Like I think a lot of the big interest in this generative AI stuff is it's very fun to share them and to build them. And so yeah, one of the things that we launched, which isn't fully featured, but it's basically a hub, a way of sharing these prompts and then these chains which are configured by the prompts and then even the agents themselves, and basically making it easy to share modular components and making it easy for other people to pull them down and use them in their own kind of like code base and applications.
I saw some other companies are selling prompt because there's just so many. I love Midjourney personally, so I play but you just run out of ideas, right? So, but you're not thinking about monetizing. This is complete just, for the community.
Yeah, I think like right now, like I don't know. I think the overarching thing that I feel is that it's like so early on in the space and it's moving so fast. And so, yeah, we're like everything we've done so far is open source. And I think like, especially around prompts, like, there's been, yeah, I don't know how defensible it is to kind of like monetize prompts. So I think we're very much in the spirit of sharing them.
In the spirit of building communities, I last checked this morning, you have 235 contributors on GitHub that is supporting LangChain, and it's only been 6 months. That's super impressive. How do you actually organize? Like, do you actually say, this is a framework, this is what we want to develop, and just please help? And for our audience who are developers, if they want to get involved, like, what would you tell us?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think there's so part of LangChain is connecting to all these different things, and so I think that's been part of the reason that there are so many contributors, because people can contribute something, an application for an instance of a language model. So like I think today we added in a contribution for language models that were hosted on like SageMaker, and so it's really easy to contribute those. There's document loaders which load different type of documents, and so it's easy to contribute those. And so I think like how we manage it is, I think we spend a lot of time thinking of the framework and the right abstractions. Like there should be a concept of a document loader, and like what is the right concept of a document loader. And then we're super enthusiastic about community members contributing like specific instances of the document loaders and thinking about general abstractions as well, although that takes a little bit more time. I forget what the rest of your question was.
If I'm a developer and I want to get involved, what should I do? Yes.
We need to be a little bit better organized about this. I think we have a bit too many GitHub issues open at the moment, but I think the best way to the easiest and best way that I would recommend to getting involved is take one of these abstractions that exist, whether it be a document loader or a tool, and kind of think about a variation of that you would be most interested in using. I think, again, there's such a long tail of use cases. There's so many different APIs you can connect to. There's so many different sources of data, Notion, Google Drive, different websites. Yep. I think thinking about what would make that kind of like, about what you would need for your specific use case, building something with it, and then ideally contributing it back to the repo would probably be the best way.
This is not in the question that I sent you earlier. What do you think about all these launched this past week with GPT-4, which seems very exciting, and then Microsoft just now building Copilot, but basically for their CRM. There's all these like new things. Is it making your job much more difficult because now you have to, or what are your thoughts in general?
I think so for the a lot of the announcements this week around the new models didn't actually impact us that I think I think it's great for the community. I think it's great for the ecosystem. It wasn't actually a lot of work for us to kind of like support them. Like I think the OpenAI one, for example, you just swap out the model name. Very easy. There wasn't a lot of work there. I think the one that did cause us a lot of headache was the release of like the Chat GPT endpoint. Because like, yeah, very technically that API was very different than the previous endpoint. And a lot of the abstractions we had were around the idea of like text in, text out. And now you've got messages in and a message out. And this message also has format, it's got the content and it's got the role. And so we spent, that put us back like a week or two kind of thinking about like the right abstractions for how to think about like chat models. And so, yeah, I mean, like, going forward, I know like OpenAI is talking about multimodal stuff. And so I think it will be, it sounds like that will, yeah, very, I think that will be a bit more of a headache, but for the previous ones this week, it actually wasn't that bad.
For our fellow developers and founders in the room, I really want to give you great applause that you have so many great adoption so far. What exactly work or not work in the past 6 months, like in terms of driving developer adoption? How much time do you spend on Twitter every day to like on update? Because I follow you, I'm like, did this person, yeah, what didn't work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd never done open source before this. It's not like I had a playbook and also when I started it, I definitely wasn't thinking about starting a company around it. It was kind of something that I was doing on the side because I saw some common abstraction, thought it would be fun. And so I think the general philosophy that I just kind of like went into it with was like, build something that's actually useful and like be nice about it, be nice to people in the community. And so like when people like contributed things like, yeah, I think I put a lot of time into, I didn't tweet a lot before this, and I am now, but I think like, I think it's like really important to recognize people when they contribute valuable things. And so I think like, yeah, just trying to focus on like adding valuable things. And then when people do add awesome stuff, like giving them kind of like the shout out and the credit for that. I think like, yeah, I think that's definitely, and even now, like, when there's definitely some aspect of like tweeting out to like, raise awareness and stuff like that. But I think a big part of it is still giving credit to a lot of the people who help add these things. Yeah.
So is Twitter your main form of communication? Do you use Discord? Do you use other things?
Yeah, we have a Discord as well. I think the Twitter we mostly use for kind of like announcing new features and releases and publicly shouting out and people. Discord we use more for coordination of some of like the in-person events, more like anything around like bugs or feature requests. We have like dedicated channels for that, so it's a bit more in the weeds.
And so now is your first time contributing open source. You're doing pretty good so far. But I guess what is the biggest challenge, like no longer term? This is a company now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so what are you like, what keep you up at night?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think one obvious point, which was mentioned earlier, was how to, turn open source into a business. And yeah, having never done open source, I have no idea how to do that. So I think we'll figure that out.
You guys should totally talk.
Yeah. I think the other thing that, like, irrespective of that is like, again, like the main thing that I feel about this market and everything in the moment is that it's super early. And so it's moving super fast. And so I think like the thing that keeps me up at night is that, we have all this code base already. Is that going to slow us down, or are we going to be distracted by that and not recognize the next thing that's coming? I think like, when we launched the first package initially, we're around like the idea of agents and chaining and all this stuff. I think that was definitely, there was papers out that we kind of like drew a lot of the abstractions from, but I think it wasn't, I think it was a newer idea that today is much more kind of like common and people, I think I saw today that like Microsoft released something kind of like very similar in the vein. And so I think like we always want to be thinking what's like 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road. And so I think the thing that keeps me up at night is like we're too focused on like all these like GitHub issues and stuff like that, and we can't think in longer term, which even in this space, like 3 months is like long term. So
yeah. But you did work on a partnership this past week. You have an announcement to make too, right?
Yeah, I think we announced this on Twitter yesterday. But I think one of the, as I mentioned, one of the applications that I'm most excited about is like the agent personal assistant style thing. And I think the big blocker there is having the collection of tools that you're able to use and hook into. And so Zapier has the biggest collection of tools I think out there. They have like 20,000 different tools. And so actually, yeah, we worked pretty closely with the CEO there they have this new API where you can hook into their tools with natural language, which makes it really easy to call from LangChain. So you can use now all of they have this, NLA APIs where you can just interact with their 20,000 tools, and so there's a nice integration there, and that was very exciting. Yeah, I think again, like the personal assistance is the stuff that I find most exciting. The blocker, there's the tools. There's now like 20,000 new tools, so that was pretty fun.
If everything is open source, do you know how many apps is built on LangChain today?
No.
Okay. Do you want to know?
I think at some point we will. I think like right now I think again like there's like two of us full time. There's one contractor who's also close to full time. So we're still pretty there's only so much we can do, and I think we're really focused on just like trying to provide the most value and getting the most adoption. And so I think like at some point it would be a good idea to have some sense of who's using this and how they're using this, and do that a bit more systematically. But I think we're trying to just go as fast as possible and get it out and then track it a bit better later on.
And UI hiring, like, because 3 people is really not enough.
Yeah. So we are definitely hiring, mostly looking for kind of like full stack folks. So I think one thing that and so why are we hiring full stack folks? I think one thing that we realize is that these applications or these language models make it easy for all types of developers to build these applications, right? You don't have to be an ML expert. You don't have to be like a data science expert. You can be a full stack engineer and build these things. And I think my background is definitely more in ML. My co-founder's background is also more in ML and data. And so we're looking to hire pretty aggressively on the full stack side, because we think this is a pretty big area where there's a lot of need. So if you guys know anyone, definitely let me know.
Okay. So with that, I actually want to open up the floor for anybody who have questions, and we have the microphone at the back, and please say your name and what you're working on, and then your questions. Maybe we start with the front.
Hey, Harrison. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today. I know LangChain's been hosting a lot of meetups in the city, right? And it seems like you guys are going pretty aggressive on kind of the whole building community front, also in person. Want to just hear a little bit more about kind of rationale and the strategy, I guess, you're taking to like really build and foster the community for all this in the city and otherwise.
Yeah, I think the rationale is I think like there's a ton of interest in this stuff, and I think like especially in the space of actually building things, and I think that's the type of like community and energy that we want to tap into. And so the strategy for that as well is I think we want to make it really focused on developers and people building things. So at the last meetup, we had like 4 kind of like presentations at the start, and then we did a happy hour, right? We tried not to do just like not just the happy hour. We try to add some like and so I think like in the four presentations we had were like one was the Zapier integration, one was the Dungeons and Dragons demo that I mentioned, and then someone talked about reinforcement learning from AI feedback, and then someone else talked about kind of like a hodgepodge of things that they'd worked on. And so I think why do we want to do this? We think there's a lot of people really interested in building these things. They want to talk about it. They want to see demos. And so that's also the strategy that we're taking, is really putting an emphasis on that as opposed to just like meet up, get drinks, stuff like that.
Yeah, he doesn't want to encourage drink and code at the same time. You can drink and drive. Okay.
Hi. My name is Billy. I'm an econ major here at Berkeley. So thank you so much for building this amazing tool. Like, I'm not like super technical person, but I was able to use LangChain to build something with it. So I was trying to build a search engine that can analyze economic data, right? And then the next thing I know, like the new Bing GPT came out. So like my project becomes to some extent obsolete because Bing is plugged to the internet and it's so fast. And I know there's a lot of companies out there a couple months ago that tried to do PowerPoint generation using GPT. And now yesterday, Office 365 just came out. And this company to some extent become obsolete as well. So my question for you guys is, how are investors investing in AI companies? Well, in the meantime, OpenAI and Microsoft are so aggressive in promoting new models and new features.
question for me? What? I'd love to hear your thought, and less not about the investor point of view. I really think the different foundational model are like, who knows, but it seems like right now between OpenAI, Anthropic, and other, could be the future iOS and Android, but it's not in full form yet. So even like for LangChain, you have to adjust, right? Things could break. And as you said, a lot of applications that built on a foundation model that is not 100% solid yet, they can't really be the iOS and Android yet. But yet, I think for us, that's why we would rather work with sort of more infrastructure, because application level, the way that we look at it, sure, is sort of similar to what mobile did to consumer, which, wow, now every single game needs to be on mobile. And I think what OpenAI or this whole interaction is really to sort of the human, particular for SaaS, for business operation. Now every single business, like consumer, will have that expectation. I need to have the ChatGPT-like interaction, to have the personal assistant on every single thing that I do. So in that sense, what we want to invest in things that will have long-term value, not instant gratification for 3 months. We wanted to see something where whatever that you're building, hopefully this Dungeons and Dragon game is going to last for a long time, but not something that is going to break. Or I love Midjourney. I actually pay for it, but I don't use that for fun. So I'm probably going to stop paying for it just because I'm already sort of over it. So in some sense, it needs to be ingrained in my day-to-day behavior. Then you're solving like a long-term value. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have two things to say here. Like one, I think even on the infrastructure point, like I think like for the next 6 months in particular, I think the space is going to be moving so fast that, the approach that we're taking is really trying to think about what will actually be valuable in 6 months and just moving towards there as fast as possible. Like I'm sure OpenAI is working on things that will render some of LangChain obsolete. And so I think like, that's a fact of life. And I think we have to kind of like, I think we're very cognizant of that fact. On the application side, like I think the two main things that I've seen that make applications kind of differentiated, one is like a specific source of data that's unique to either you or the end users that you're building for. So if you can kind of like hook into their kind of like knowledge systems in a differentiated way, or if you have a specific source of data, this also gets a little bit into like the feedback loop. So if you can start collecting feedback quickly and get some like interesting kind of like data around how people interact with an app, people will be able to get that same data eventually, but you'll have some of like a head start there. So I think like personalized data is kind of like one way. And then the other way is kind of like way more kind of like complex kind of like workflows and integrations with things. So I think like this Dungeons and Dragons thing, I think the reason, and also this goes for a lot of the personal assistant style things. Personal assistants are like hard. They need to be like really integrated into your workflows. They need to have a lot of connections. It's not kind of like a simple call to a language model and then generate some other text. And so I think like those are the types of things that will be more differentiated. I also think a lot of these are very naturally kind of like features in existing products at existing companies, right? So like existing companies have a lot of products with personalized data and complex workflows that already exist. And so, I think, I think the same kind of like ideas of how to differentiate also goes for existing companies building features.
And one other thing I do want to emphasize, if you're working on application level, at the end of the day, at the very beginning, which is what Harrison is working on, it's all about adoption.
Yeah.
And then you really need to, if you're building consumer related things, and if I double click on it, okay, what's the retention? What's the churn? How much time do you actually spend on it? Is it really like on certain use cases that is so critical that your user cannot live without? This actually have nothing to do with generative AI or not. It's more or less just basic KPI and metrics that I think all founders need to think about. Okay, so I think your neighbor has a question.
Hi, I'm Romel. I'm a CS PhD student here at Berkeley. So my question is about interfaces and abstractions, right? So right now, each LLM or like all these providers have like very different interfaces to interact with those models. Do you see us converging onto like a standard API or interface in the near future, or do you think that things are moving so fast it's hard to have a standard right now?
I think it will be tough to get a standard for sure, but I think there are definitely like common things that you can kind of like draw on in the meantime, and we'll see how it goes. So for example, with like the chat model that OpenAI released, like I think after that came out, we spent a bunch of time talking with the Anthropic team to see if it would work with their model, and then less time with the Google team, although we have since recently, and there's some commonalities, right? And some of the stuff we did initially works out pretty well, and so that'll be good going forward, and then we'll maybe adapt some stuff. But like as soon as stuff goes multimodal, that may blow some things up. So I think it's like kind of to both. Like you can take some best guesses, but we're absolutely not baking. We're not like we're taking some best guesses. We're trying to use those. We're not committing to those like 100% because I think they'll definitely change.
Friends in front.
Give the mic to this gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Tomas Fernandez. I'm a big fan of LangChain. I've been using it. I had a question. Are you planning to add any features around fine-tuning?
Yeah, I think so my background's in like MLOps, and so I think like when I started it, I was like, we're going to do this within like a month or something like that, and so it's definitely top of mind. I think so like why haven't we? I think like a lot of what's guided the development of LangChain is like what is the blocker for people building applications with language models, and I don't actually think that's fine tuning at the moment for the vast majority of folks. I think maybe for bigger use cases and enterprises, it definitely is, and so I think when we have more folks on board, that's absolutely something we'll be building out. But I think a lot of it so far just been like, for the application developer, what is the blocker? I don't really think that's been fine tuning so far, and so that's why we haven't.
Fair.
Hi, I'm Ahmed Fatour. I run an investment firm that mostly doing things much later stage than here, but we always have to kind of see what's cooking at the earliest stages. One of the questions I have is, big part of the promise of generative AI is the democratization of creation. And you sit here creating some or building some very important tools, still focused on the developer side. And I wonder whether it's part of your vision or whether you have views on how this evolves to the point where the large and distributed user base begins to be able to use the language interfaces to create their own functionality. I won't even call it applications because they may not be trying to monetize it with others, but at what point does the developer community get disintermediated, and is there an infrastructure that starts to evolve in that direction?
I think there probably is. I think like so we've been extremely focused on the developers so far with, again, going back to like the belief that it's super early in the space, it's super fast moving, and a lot of these abstractions are changing. I think there's definitely been a few attempts to build kind of like more UI based things that do enable like all folks to build these types of programs and stuff. I think that's, I think that's incredibly powerful. I think that's something that's extremely interesting. I don't think the time is right for that right now. When will it be? I don't know, but yeah, I think that's my kind of my answer to that.
I'm Bernard from Race Capital, creator of Chatterjam. I remember sort of first using LangChain back in December, and sort of the memory component was really eye-opening. I guess, how do you see agent playing a part in the long term, and how would prompts sort of enable agents to have sort of memory baked in, AIs and agents themselves writing prompts, and how everything will work in that aspect?
Yeah, I think there's a few interesting points there. One around like the AI writing prompts. I think this falls under generally. Yeah, I think there's a few really interesting sub themes here. One is like the idea of using like AI to do like AI assisted feedback, and so like and this gets into like evaluating prompts basically. I am extremely bullish on that. I think like when we do start building out stuff around like fine tuning and platforms for that will 100% be a part of that. I think another step, and there's been some really cool papers. One about like I think it was like the automated prompt engineer paper where they write their own kind of like prompts. I think that's pretty cool as well. I think I'm a bit more bullish on like just the feedback side of using AI. And then around like around memory and agents, I think like I think there's I think it's still, I think there's still a lot of work to be done to figure out like what the, like memory is so broad, and I'm kind of using it as like a really general cop-out catchphrase for things, right? Like it's got like the short-term chat messages, you've got some like long-term stuff. I think there's a lot of really interesting work to be done around like what is the best structure for memory. I think even right now when people are doing some of the more long-term stuff with like retrieval augmented generation, it's pretty much a standard like look up into a vector database, get the documents. I think you can start doing some pretty interesting like filtering around like the metadata to start like improving that a little bit. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty big topic by itself. But I think, yeah, I think memory, very important. Lots of stuff to be done that I don't think is being done at the moment.
So on that note, like we had some conversation earlier about sort of the ethic side of things, or privacy or security. What do you think about that? Are you building in anything like a framework within LangChain to help developers to make better decision in this area?
Yeah, I think the idea of like security and like risk, and there's lots of different aspects of security and risk, right? So like, the company I worked at previously was like testing and validation of machine learning models, mostly on like the traditional like logistic regression structured sense, but it's way more important for these foundation model eras, and I think a lot of the same concepts kind of apply. I think like there's, yeah, I mean, there's a few different things. There's kind of like the bias that's inherent in the models that I think was talked about earlier. I think there's the idea on a more like just like literal data level that companies don't want to be sending their data across an API, and so having models that are in-house is like a big thing for a lot of these companies. And then I think there's also like there's and I don't think, yeah, and then there's also the aspect of, even if you are using a model, like these are like non-deterministic things that you don't really know what's coming out. And so we're putting a lot of work into basically in the past like few months, basically, you know, the language model is text in, text out, but you often expect the text going in to have specific properties, and you often expect the text coming out to have specific properties, and those can be things like a schema, right? So it should be returning a specific schema that has like, in question answering, like the answer and then the source that it's coming from or something like that. But then you can also expect some properties like, hey, like the output shouldn't be racist or something like that. And so we're working on kind of like the concepts of like output parsing and guards to like basically enforce these types of properties that we as humans expect, but the language model is just like, hey, there's just like text coming out, that's all I know. And so yeah, I think the idea of like putting validators around the output is really important for ensuring that these things are functioning as you expect.
Yeah, and I think like especially for enterprise, if there's validator and guard on things that, I don't know if I'm using the right, like the negative, please don't show this whole list and just point to a file, then it will make life so much easier. No surprises.
Yeah, no, and I think there's also, going back to the previous question, there's some, you can start to do that with language models themselves as well. So there's a really cool paper by Anthropic around like constitutional AI, where they take a language model, make a prediction, then they ask another language model to critique it, and then they ask another language model to make a revision based on that critique. And so I think like that concept is actually like, language models are getting pretty good at like, and so as long as you like set them up in the correct way, I think that's a pretty powerful idea.
Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? A friend in front from IBM.
Yes, my name is Alex Stroke. I'm a director of open source science at IBM, so I take open source aspect very much. So what bothers me in this evolution right now, basically we're all working against one, or maybe soon two or three, original models, right? So we're all building little layers, which are hardly defensible. Like, surely if you move very fast, 6 months ago, the next big point. The question is, as open source community, what do you think we should do to democratize the source of this? Do you see the future where we will have community models like Bloom, which we will maintain, and then how does your tech will be transferable? Do you think that memory, state, integrations will be all portable, should all standardized, or we talk to multiple models?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think open source will probably always lag behind the private models. I think both will start progressing. And so then I think it depends on the use case. I think they'll always, so if your use case falls in this delta, you'll want to use the private models. If it falls below, then you'll want to use the public ones. I think both will start growing up. So I think more and more use cases will be solved by kind of like some of the public models. I think and then so like how does the framework work with that? I think there's two components to that. One's like the kind of like literal technical kind of like code definitions and stuff like that. And so I think we have good abstractions for that, and people can already use Hugging Face models. They can already use locally hosted models, all of that stuff. I think there's a separate kind of like really tricky thing, which is like, will the prompts still work? And so we're actually seeing this between like versions of like GPT, like a prompt that, or like versions of OpenAI and Anthropic, like a prompt that works well for one won't work well for another. And so we don't have an amazing solution for that. I think there's two ideas that we're kind of like thinking about for that. One is a bit more in kind of like the MLOps side, which is just making it easy to like compare and evaluate prompts on different models. And then another for like people getting started easily, we want to have this concept where like depending on the model that you pass in, that we select the right prompt based on that. And that's more aimed at just making it really easy to get started off the shelf. So kind of two different solutions for two different types of folks.
That's exciting. Any other questions? Going once, going twice? Okay, our Bernard is so awesome. He probably tested every single module that you have. Okay.
I guess, given everyone here is so excited about LangChain, is there anything you can share that is not fully public yet? Any funding rounds?
We recently raised some money that we'll be announcing soon. But that's not fun. That's not fun. I'm sure you're more excited about the technical stuff. I mean, like the guardrails aspect is one part that we've got some stuff out for, but that we're going to add a lot more. And I think that's really interesting. I think where there's some cool stuff we're working on basically extracting. You've got all this unstructured data. You can extract structured data from that, and sometimes that's more useful than kind of just indexing that unstructured data. And so there's some cool stuff we're working on there. I think the idea of like memory is something that we're really excited about, and so we'll probably be pushing. That's maybe like a few months away, but I think we'll be pushing pretty hard on that.
My final question is, let's say a year from now, what do you see for LangChain? How's that going to look like?
I mean, I think in the best case, it's the framework for developing language model applications. Okay. So yeah, I'll go with that.
All right. With that, thank you so much, Harrison, for taking the time. If you can hang out for a few more minutes, I'm sure that tons of developers have questions for you.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me.